Welcome to Age of AI, Politics, Law, and Society, hosted by Medlir Mema, Chris Lamont, and Young Diogenes, in association with the Global Governance Institute in Brussels.
Hi, this is your host, Medlir Mema. We meet today under the shadow of war, and everywhere we turn, we hear of yet another AI-enabled technology either deployed or being prepared for deployment in the battlefield. Whether it is drone warfare in the Russia-Ukraine conflict or Israel's deployment of the Iron Dome or of the Lavender program in Gaza and the West Bank, decisions about who lives and dies are increasingly influenced by opaque and arguably unaccountable algorithms. It is against this troubling background that I'm joined today by Dr. Paige Arthur, a Director of Global Programming at Columbia Global, part of Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Arthur was a Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the NYU Center on International Cooperation, where she led the center's work on conflict prevention and peace building. Together with Branka Panic, Dr. Arthur is the author of AI for Peace, a topic that has received a lot of attention recently and will be the subject of our conversation today. Paige, welcome to Age of AI.
Thanks so much for having me, Medlir.
I appreciate you taking some time on this beautiful summer day, I suppose. I know it's getting really hot in New York, so I hope you're staying in the indoors, perhaps, air conditioning.
Yes, we have the heat wave, which has been in the news, but I'm inside.
You're okay. Well, first, before we get into the heart of the matter, could you tell us, although this is also the heart of the matter, but tell us a little bit about Columbia Global. You just made the transition there, and I know that you're working with a lot of locations throughout the world. If you can tell us a bit about your work and what you're doing at Columbia, that'd be great.
Oh, thanks so much for the chance to do that. I'm really pleased to be invited to be on the program, Medlir. Thanks a lot. And I'm glad to be able to introduce Columbia Global as well, because it's a new initiative at Columbia University. It was founded about 2 years ago, and it's drawing together a number of entities and initiatives that were pre-existing. But the purpose of Columbia Global is to try to bring the expertise from across the university to bear on some of the world's most pressing challenges. So things like climate change, things like forced migration, the issues of our time. The university has such a rich and deep interdisciplinary expertise across all of its schools. And we were wondering, how can we leverage that to partner locally with governments, with civil society, with local academia to really develop initiatives around that. And then my role specifically at Columbia Global is I work with our physical presences all around the world, because Columbia actually has 10 physical locations from Beijing and Mumbai all the way to Rio de Janeiro and Santiago, Chile. And so I work with all of those centers and really trying to be the connector between the expertise, the local centers, and local actors to develop these projects. So that's Columbia Global in a nutshell and what I do. So it's a really fascinating time to be at Columbia.
Well, speaking of fascinating times, let me transition perhaps to another question that is related to the work that you're doing, and that is your assessment as you're looking globally, because you're not just looking what's happening with the United States or within, let's say, in New York, although there's plenty happening there. But just when you think globally, especially in the context of technologies, but also emerging technologies, but beyond that as well, what's your assessment of the current moment in international politics?
Oh, wow. It is a tough moment right now. It is a tough moment, but it's not surprising, I would say.
Okay. Well, why is that? That's a surprising answer. So why is that?
Well, in the sense that we've seen for the past 5+ years, I think a rising instability, a rising inability of international institutions of all kinds to manage conflicts and to manage risks. So not just the United Nations, which I think gets a lot of the focus, but also a lot of the regional organizations. I think of very good friends of mine working at ECOWAS in West Africa. Right. West Africa is dealing with a lot of instability right now. There have been a high number of coups after a period of relative peace in that region, and ECOWAS was one of the key drivers of that. So I think that there's so much that's happened in the past few years, from COVID to shutting down the world economy to rising debt in the global south. And that means restricted budgets to help with things like social safety nets, those things we think of as the pillars of peaceful civil societies. I think there's a sense that those pillars are weakening globally, and our institutions are, for many reasons, including geopolitical reasons and geopolitical tensions, those institutions really aren't functioning as well as we need them to be. So for me, it's not a surprise to see conflicts erupting in the way that they are, and I'm worried.
Yeah. Well, it's against this background, again, that your book also comes out, AI for Peace. I picked it up as a digital copy on Kindle and was able to read that. And I really appreciate, I think, the thoughtfulness and considering some of this, at least laying the groundwork for what the research in this area at least would look like. Tell us a little bit more about the motivation for the book itself, your collaboration with Branka, and what the intention behind it was.
Well, that's a great question. And first of all, I have to acknowledge my co-author, Branka Panic.
Right.
So Branka and I had been working together really for the past 4 years. The book really came out of two initiatives that one led by myself and one led by Branka, but that we also collaborated on. So when I worked at the Center on International Cooperation at NYU, I led all of our work on conflict prevention and peace building. And as part of that, I built a program on data-driven approaches to prevention. A lot of that was focused on trying to create the space for people working in different sectors to come together and to understand how they could collaborate with one another. So it was trying to reach to the peace builders, to people in government policy, but also to technologists, to private sector. Let's bring them all together, and then let's see, first of all, what people are doing, and then what partnerships are possible. So we did a lot of convening around that, global meetings on things like early warning and early action, on how can we learn from the humanitarian sector. And Branka really put together a lot of that work for us. So I was working with Branka for 4 years on this initiative, doing a lot of convening. Branka also led a mapping that we did of everybody who was working on the space. So our thinking was that this has laid the groundwork. This has set the agenda for what could be done. And now others can take it into the next stage, whether it's at the UN or in research, private sector, et cetera. And then when I left CIC, I took a sabbatical last year, basically. And Branka and I had the idea to write this book together, a culmination of the work that we had done and the things that we had learned across those 4 years. We felt that there was nothing written on this. We also felt that there wasn't something out there that was accessible that could speak to both technologists and to people in the peace building field. Usually you could speak to one, but not to the other. And we also felt there was a need for a primer, even for people doing coursework, probably graduate level, but maybe upper undergraduate level, to introduce the subject. Here's the state of the art right now. But we do also always say that, and we mentioned this in the book, as soon as this goes to print, it's out of date. And that's just the nature of working in this field.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Or perhaps out of date, or perhaps other opportunities have come up that are not included in there, or the ones that are included there perhaps have also not fulfilled their potential. And we'll get to this a little bit at the end of the program about the fact that a lot of these AI-enabled technologies, they appear more as mirages rather than realities. And how do we guard against that possibility? Let's talk a little bit about some definitions. We have both AI and peace. And for political scientists, of course, peace is a very contested space. How do you define peace? Are we at a moment of peaceful coexistence right now? Is the absence of war enough for us to say that we're at peace?
Well, I think different societies may define peace in different ways. So I'll give you my take on it. And I do follow the inventor of the peace studies field, Johan Galtung, who distinguished between what he called negative peace and positive peace. You think of negative peace as the absence of violence in a country, whereas positive peace is a country or a society in which, for example, solidarity and social trust, there are strong civic political and community institutions to manage conflict as they arise. And I think that the difference between, that's just a part of positive peace, but I think the difference is that I really see peace in terms of positive peace rather than just an absence of violence. And this goes back probably to my background. If you were to get into my biography a bit deeper, Medlir, you'd know that and you do know this already, but I come out of the human rights field.
Right.
I worked in international human rights for 15 years. And my approach to conflict prevention really comes from a rights-based approach.
Yeah.
And so for me, peace is about the enjoyment of right and being able to make claims that are rights-based claims in a society. So that for me, the peace is a larger construct than just the absence of violence.
So let me take this just a little bit further before, and I think I know the answer, but it's probably important to discuss that anyways. And the question is whether enduring peace can be achieved through military means or rather military technologies. And here I'm specifically talking about, there's a lot of discussion, let's say, about the stabilizing or destabilizing impact of nuclear weapons. People like Kenneth Waltz argue that actually nuclear weapons during the Cold War played a stabilizing role in the international system. So that's an example of military technology that leads to peaceful outcomes. Again, perhaps the more narrow definition of the negative peace than the one that you are discussing here. But we've also had guests in the program that have also talked about the fact that new AI-enabled technologies, they believe that those technologies, because they perhaps increase deterrent threats or they give space to governments to perhaps focus on the kinds of actions that you were talking about that leads to positive peace, that somehow these AI-enabled technologies may actually lead to more peaceful, even though there are military uses of them, they may lead to more peaceful societies. Any thoughts on this, or is this too abstract, perhaps?
I don't think it's abstract at all. I do think there's a difference between stability and peace, and that gets at that distinction between negative and positive peace that I was talking about. Even if you speak with people in the military and military leaders about whether they think military solutions alone lead to peace, they will often say, actually, we need additional actions to that. That's a prerequisite in their mind, but not sufficient to peace. And that there's a lot of work that needs to be done around institution building, around trust, and around communities. That's in addition to the military means. So I would think, at least with the U.S. military, which is what I'm most familiar with, that's a more common perception. And we could look back at different actions, military actions, and how they were not sufficient for peace by themselves. Yeah,
I'm reminded here, obviously, of the neocon argument in the early 2000s about spreading democracy, making the world safe for democracy, but you do that through military force. Wilsonianism with boots, I think, is what they referred to them at the time, and so that's where I was getting at with that, and I appreciate you clarifying that for me. Let's talk about some of the examples, and then I want to come back again to some of the pathologies, perhaps, of how technology affects peace. But before I do that, let's talk about some of the examples from the book. You've talked about how AI can be used for conflict prediction. We actually had in our program just not too long ago, Dr. Hannes Medlir, who you're familiar with his work, of course, conflict forecasting. And so conflict prediction, the question of hate speech and polarization, and this seems like it could spill over the other way. In this case, technology actually worsens peaceful coexistence because it leads and drives towards polarization, impact on human rights, and impact on climate change. Talk to us a little bit about any of those topics. We'll probably get into a couple of those, but you can start where you want to. But then I have some follow-ups to that.
Well, we have 5 chapters in the book, and we had to make selections here because there's only so much that we could cover. And we felt that these were the ones where there was some of the more promising initiatives. So we talk about conflict forecasting, like you say, misinformation, disinformation, hate speech. We have a chapter on human rights and how AI is being used for human rights protection and for investigations. One on how it's being used to better understand the relationship between climate change and conflict, because that's not an easy, direct causal relationship. And then we have the anchor of the book, and the last chapter is the chapter on ethics and ethical use of AI. And what does it mean for peace builders to use AI? Because peace builders have a very anchored ethical approach to the work that they do. It's anchored in local communities and problem solving. So I think you had Hannes on the show. He's really a leader in this field. So I recommend to listeners to go back and listen to the podcast that you just had with him. In the book, I try to survey what's happening now, what is the state of the art. We talk about the limitations of conflict forecasting. Really what it can do at this point is it can give a sense of where the highest risks are, and in particular, both at country level and sometimes at regional level within a country, depending on whether the data is available at that level or not. A lot of the people doing conflict forecasting have integrated more deep learning techniques into the forecasting, which has helped them really be able to draw on much larger data sets. I'm really trying to identify at country level what are the most important risk factors for this particular society, because they're different for each society. It could be regional inequality for one, it could be geography, or for another, it could be drought or climate. It really all depends. So I think using random forest techniques, I think that's the main one that people are using in terms of deeper learning. For the conflict forecasting, I think the limitations are very real, though, and I think we need to be very sanguine about that. Where there is difficulty is in predicting the onset of conflict, where there has not been conflict before. And I think that's a problem that Hanif is in particular working on himself. But that's a very hard problem, because then you're looking at dynamic change rather than looking at more static indicators. And also, I think the challenge with conflict is that a lot of the information or data that you would want in order to be able to make predictions about conflict, you don't have access to it. And it's deliberately secretive. It's deliberately kept secret because political leaders don't want to share with you their plans or what they're thinking. This idea that, would there have been some model that could have predicted Putin's decision to invade Ukraine? Are all sorts of miscommunication and information failures involved in that. It's not clear that a forecasting model would be able to easily account for that.
I'm reminded here of Robert Jervis's work on perceptions and misperceptions, and how at the heart of it, this is a human endeavor. And I think what I hear you saying, at least, is that this may be difficult to capture in a model. But one thing that I did raise with Hannes when we spoke was this issue of dataism and overemphasis on pattern recognition over scientific explanation. And that is that all we're doing at this point, even with his predicting on the basis of pattern recognition, what is likely to happen, but we don't have any theory of the case. We don't know why those things are associated together. What is the solution to that? Because my fear as we go into this space, I was going to ask you a question whether AI is more, at least the way we're using it, especially in social sciences, is more than just pattern recognition. I know that there are all kinds of approaches to it, but I feel like that's the one that we're really honing in on, is the pattern recognition part. And it's the kind that blindly leads us to this blind adherence to data is truth. And we know that data is very political. And as you point out, data can also be biased. Algorithms can also be biased. The people that set up the algorithms can also be biased. And so we get to all kinds of dead ends as a result of that. What is the solution to something like that, where we just focus so much on patterns and we ignore actually the real causes, right? We have a lot of correlation, and the forecasting could be accurate, but we don't really know what's happening, and so we can't really address the underlying conditions that are causing the conflict in the first place.
I think that's a great question, and I know there's a whole debate around the role of theory right now in conflict forecasting. I think one of the key points I really want to emphasize here is that any judgment coming out of a model, conflict forecasting model at this point, should really only be seen as one point of reference among many.
Good.
It shouldn't be a determining factor in anyone's policy-making decision. And that's not what anyone that I know of is arguing for. And yet I think there's this public perception sometimes that, we'll get the data and then we'll know what to do. That's not what anybody is advocating for. It's really about having a richer picture that can be more data informed, but not to have something be determinative from a forecasting model. And the forecasting models aren't there yet either, so that would be inappropriate.
The reason why I raise that question is partly because, and listeners of our podcast will know because I always talk about this, and that is that we do have a tendency as humans to trust technology. So there are initial road or guardrails. We tend to be a bit more cautious. We standoffish. But then once we start relying on it, we just take shortcuts. That's how we survive as species in a way. We take shortcuts. And my fear is that for you and Hannes and others, this space obviously is very contextualized. And this is only one more data point in terms of making decisions down the road. But I do fear that whether us or decision makers now or in the future, just take a shortcut and say, okay, I can see that there's a prediction here of conflict. I am going to take out my investments from this country, or we're going to send an alert with regards to our people traveling to this place. I just wonder about this. And this is also part of a bigger question here. And the bigger question is about societal changes in society to the degree that we are trusting more and more decision-making, or if we go in that direction of trusting more and more of these kinds of analysis to AI systems that, as I point out on the top of the show, are unaccountable and very opaque, that we're going toward a society that is almost a post-Enlightenment society. And I'm not the first one to raise this question and this concern, but the whole exercise of the Enlightenment revolution was that we are scientific in our approach to regards to the society. We experiment, we have data, we theorize, we hypothesize, and then we test. And dataism is a term that several people have used, but leads us away from that. And that's my broader concern, I guess. It's not just about the conflict forecasting, but it's our general approach to how we study reality, where more and more we really don't understand what's going on. We just know that it's going on because an algorithm told us that this is the likely outcome.
Well, I couldn't agree more, Medlir, with everything that you just said. A couple of points there on the policymakers. I can say that it's absolutely accurate. What you are suggesting is that this is what they're looking for, a data point that will just tell them this is the trend.
Right.
This gives us the signal what to do. I've been in the meetings and I've heard it. And so that is worrying. I mean, a big part of what Branka and I were focusing on in the work that we did together was around data literacy for policymaking, because there just is a huge gap in general. I'm sure it's not just in the peace-building field, but especially in the peace-building field, between people who have the technical knowledge and then people who are in decision-making positions. And so that's something that needs to be worked on sort of every day, because that's just an important, like you say, this is going to be a decades-long cultural shift that we have to really start working on. And then the second issue around enlightenment. So it's funny that you mentioned that, because I was at a meeting about a month and a half ago talking about these issues, but talking about it in the context we call the dialectic of enlightenment. So the Frankfurt School critique of the Enlightenment, and how could the Enlightenment, which was this era of scientific curiosity and classifying the world and really shedding light on the human endeavor, how does it lead to something as dark as totalitarianism and Nazism? That was their fundamental question. And I don't want to draw any comparisons with that, but I do think that, like what you said, that there is, whether you call it post-Enlightenment, whatever it is, there is this dialectic between the emancipatory potential of any technology like AI and then the totalizing oppressive potential as well. And that's just something fundamentally we always have to be very intentional about and understand that it's there.
Well, on this, let's get to the hate speech and polarization conversation, because this is one that cuts both ways. Right away, there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion about the impact of AI. This is an election year. Next year is an election year. Over 3 billion people voting. It seems that most European countries will be going now to the voting booths because of the outcome of the European Parliament elections. So we know that Germany has just announced elections, or France rather, and there's pressure on Germany as well. And there's a lot of concern about hate speech and polarization. How can AI help in this direction, or stall the deluge of misinformation and disinformation? Because many argue that actually AI is going to have a worsening impact on the discourse. But do you have an optimistic take on that? How does that work?
I don't feel so optimistic about that anymore. Just because there's been so many changes even within the last year. on the positive side. There are another number of initiatives, we talk about them in the book, that are really small scale about using AI to detect hate speech. There can be civil society initiatives for that, civil society led. There's all sorts of initiatives that researchers and academics are doing to try to better do classifications of hate speech. There's a lot of that thing going on, very small scale, very bespoke. I don't see how you really tackle the challenge without partnership with the private sector and the big technology companies. And that's where there's been a change, particularly in the last year, not so much with Meta or Facebook, but with some of the other the big technology companies like X, dismantling huge parts of the regimes that were built to detect this. And so that's why I'm pessimistic now, because when we wrote the book, there was a much stronger sense of integrity, at least some corporate investment in these integrity units. And now there's been seemingly a move away from that. So I think without that private sector will, unless you have much stronger regulation than currently exists, it's hard to see how that happens. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but...
Well, so I've been looking at this issue for some time, and the question that I have that's occurred to me several times is that while I've heard a lot of talk about the impact of AI and misinformation, disinformation, and the spread of hate speech, I have seen zero, as of June of 2024, so we're future-proofing this comment, I've seen zero explanation, especially just in terms of election outcomes, about the impact of AI on election outcomes. So this is the big fear last year. And on the basis of this fear, basically NATO, the EU, United States, a bunch of other Western countries, and authoritarian countries set up a bunch of censorship boards. We can call them different things, but misinformation, disinformation, overseers, or whatever it is. The different offices that were meant to make sure that we eliminate this from the public discourse. And the rationale for that is, as I point out, is that we have elections coming up. This is a big, big problem. And as a result of that, we should be careful with this, and we should take down anything that resembles misinformation, disinformation. I do not see any evidence that AI is impacting any election outcomes. Argentina is the first AI election back in September of last year. Nothing. Romania seems to have had a switch because there was that video, but it's not clear that is actually what caused the loss of one party and the victory of the other one. And in India, obviously, we had a lot of it, and much of it was in the hands of Modi, and he is the tech guru on his own. He used holograms, and he used all kinds of technologies and technologies for hire. He lost seats. He didn't win any seats. Now, you could ask the counterfactuals, like, well, how many more would he have lost had he not used technology? We do not see any evidence. Here's my theory of the case. I don't think that AI impacts election outcomes in the way that we think it is. I think that AI affects election outcomes through polarization of society. And what I mean by that is that AI polarizes existing views. It does not cause you, let's say, to switch from one view to another. A lot of it has to do with cognitive biases because we're just invested in whatever worldview we're in. And so even if we see a fake video showing our favorite political candidate doing something we don't care for, we dismiss that because we can either dismiss it as a fake, even though it's real, or we dismiss it because we just think that, okay, that's just a one-off thing. I'm not going to engage with that. So I think we're looking at the wrong outcomes and the wrong measures. If we're looking at the impact of AI on elections, just in terms of election outcomes, I don't think we're going to capture the impact of AI in society. And this is where I appreciate about your book and your text, or the particular chapter on polarization, because I think that what we should be focusing on is the impact of AI and polarization per se. Polarizing existing views and deepening those and making those even more entrenched rather than moving people across, let's say, areas. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And I think this is an important, shift. I haven't seen this happen. I know that a lot of recent research on the impact on elections has come out and hasn't what we think we're going to see, we have not seen. And that's because we're looking in the wrong places.
Yeah. You have to also, everyone, I think, understands, hopefully, that the algorithms that are urging us to view content that's similar to things that we already like, right?
Exactly.
That's just one piece of the whole puzzle, the whole social puzzle, because you have your regular media, you have your news outlets, you have all sorts of things that are going in a more polarized direction because it does seem to be what many people like, and it is what is selling.
Right.
And so that's a larger issue. But I think you're right that it will be very interesting to have more empirical analysis and empirical studies about the effect of these things. In the book, we were mainly looking at hate speech, and we're mainly looking at something that is also empirically a bit murky, which is the relationship between online hate speech and incitement to violence, like offline violence. And it's not as though there's some very clear path always between those two things. There have certainly been instances where there was a clear path. There's no question about it. But it's not as though that's a clear path in every single case.
Yeah, thank you. What's your take, your sense with the peace-building community? Are they embracing this technology? You're talking about the importance of technology in terms of for peace. What's your sense of the international community, NGOs, and others that are working in this space?
I think that, I don't know if they're embracing it. I think this is a great question. We should do a focus group about it. I think that pretty much everybody, they probably don't know very much about AI except for what they read kind of in the newspaper and what they use as a practical matter, their productivity tools. Hopefully they're using all of those things that are AI enabled that make their life much easier, like Google Translate. So, but I think in the sense of them embracing it in their work, I don't see that happening as much as it could. And some of the factors there are around the data literacy that we were talking before. It's also, I think, a lack of understanding, how do I find a partner to help me with this? Like, I think there actually are quite a lot of technologists and data scientists out there who would love to hold hands and partner with someone on the peace building side, but how do you actually bring these communities together? That's not such an easy problem to solve. And we did some experiments, Branka and I, when I was at Center on International Cooperation, about trying to build projects, have people coming, particularly from the Global South, with great project ideas and then pairing them with data scientists and technologists, let's say over the span of a year, to try to build something together. It really was not that easy to do that. I think that there's a lot of learning that needs to happen on both sides for that to really work. I would say, I don't know, it's being embraced. I think people also know that they need to understand this better and they need to incorporate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I think that's my sense, and it's concerning because you point out the potential here for use is great, but also if you understand the risks associated with using these kinds of technologies in whatever work you're doing, you're likely to then also create some problems for the communities you're serving if you're not. And part of this is also, and this is perhaps the last question for the day, the impact of these technologies on the Global South. We're talking about AI for peace. You have a chapter on climate change as well and connecting to conflict and the fact that climate change can lead to displacement, scarcity, and everything else, and then lead to conflicts. But AI is seen as something that can promise a solution to some of these problems, but also can exacerbate those kinds of concerns because it requires so much energy, it requires a lot of water, it requires a lot of resources, but also it leads to the objectification of people in the Global South because so much of the data labeling and everything else is being done by people in the Global South. And as a result of that, there's a lot of accusations of exploitation and everything else. So there's the end product, very useful for the peace-building community or for the peace community generally, but the product itself, the underlying model that creates those products is exploitative at heart. At least some would argue that. And so how do you deal with this dissonance if you are, let's say, a human rights organization and you're fighting for the human rights of the very same people that are also being exploited at times by organizations, like by big corporations that are underpaying them across the Global South?
Yeah, we talk about that a lot in the book, particularly in the last chapter on ethics. Fundamentally, peace building is a field that comes from the bottom up. It's about really, really grounding whatever it is you're doing in local communities, in local understandings of problems and local understandings of solutions and supporting that. And so that's really the ethos of it. Also a very strong ethic of do no harm.
All right.
So built into, because so much, especially if you are an outsider coming into a community with an intervention, there really is the potential to have unintended consequences. And that's the same for AI or for any technological, any solution, whether it's AI or anything else. I think it's really important for the Global South to be much more involved and consulted and engaged in policy discussions. So I think this idea that we have the AI Act and the EU will have the Brussels effect, and that will cascade out to the Global South. I would love to see, and I would absolutely support consultation, Global South consultation about the impact of AI, looking at a variety of social domains from medicine and law to labor to education. How is it impacting people now? What is the future? And really having a much better, more grounded understanding of how people are seeing this technology in their lives, and from the negative impacts that you talked about to some of the more positive ones, being able to feed that into policy discussion at the UN, at the EU, at the regional level as relevant. So I would definitely support that approach.
Yeah. Well, there is an opportunity, I think, for anybody who's interested. In New York, obviously, September 22nd, 23rd, Summit of the Future. This is hopefully the birth of the Global Digital Compact, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
I think that's what they're going to call that. It'll be interesting to see. We'll be there, but it will be interesting to see what conversations look like and what the impact on both human rights, but as you point out, the Global South, because there is a lot of overlap there, I think will be. Well, Paige, thank you so much. This has been illuminating. I really appreciate you taking your time. I know you're very busy, but I appreciate you taking the time for us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the chance, Medlir.
Well, and thank you to our listeners. As always, if you like the show, please subscribe to Age of AI, wherever you find your podcasts. And join us again next time for another discussion at the intersection of law, society, and politics. Until then, stay human.